a 2.5 upgrade perspective, let's move into some of the new features that we talked about. So the provider invoice process, provider invoices are the invoices you download from PartnerCenter or other providers, other automatic providers, I might add. Now, the process, the way it was built before, was it tried to be a little bit more intelligent, where it would allow you to download partial invoices. So, for example, if the usage summary was not available, it would wait for the usage summary, but it would download the other bits of the provider invoice, because the provider invoice itself had multiple child records, as we called it. There was a license summary part, and there was the usage summary. And this was in effect, I think, for a good 6 months or so, this processing. And over this course, we figured out that even though whatever intelligence we might add, there was no guarantees that was coming in from the PartnerCenter. So PartnerCenter invoices were often delayed, were partially available, or in fact, in some cases, we've noticed that they changed after the first posting, which meant that if the invoice was reported as, let's say, $10,000 today, 2 days later, that same invoice Microsoft might update the same invoice to, let's say, $12,000 or whatever that other number is. So we had to have a way to handle the situation, because that meant that this could affect your downstream invoicing process as well. Partially available, like for example, people that are dealing with Azure, Microsoft would report, let's say, $5,000 of Azure usage this month, and then 2 days later, that Azure usage would then change to, let's say, 5,500 or 6,000 or whatever that number is. So there were no guarantees when it came to importing invoices from PartnerCenter, and we got a lot of feedback from this, and we really went back to the drawing board to say, what can we do to sort of make this more robust and more foolproof, rather, right? So what we've done now, and the change summary that we'll talk about, and the way this is done. One of the first principles we decided to do was, we will import the full invoice, or we will import nothing at all. As opposed to previously, we would import the license summary, it was available, and then import the usage summary as and when it was available. But right now we don't do that. We import the full invoice, or we import nothing. Which meant that the invoice statuses now are simpler to deal with. There's an active or an inactive invoice. There's no longer an active usage or an active license or an active none. We had multiple states. So right now, provider invoice is active or inactive, and that's it. It's just easier to deal with, right? There is an integrity check now performed before the invoice is imported. Now, this is an important, this addresses our partially available dilemma, right? And in that, what we do is, the invoice has a total value. So let me just pull up an invoice and let's see what that looks like. And I'll maybe explain this with the help of the screenshot here. So I've got this environment called Sky Blue. I'm going to open up a provider invoice here. Let's take this invoice, for example. Now, if you notice that this invoice has two records, there's a child record, and then there is a license summary record, and there's a usage summary record. And at the total level, Microsoft gives us a total charge for this invoice. So this invoice is, let's say, for $2,205.25, and the child records themselves report a line total, or they report a total. So what we do now is, when we import the invoice, we actually check there's a field over here called post-tax total. The line total is the one with the markup, so we don't want to add this up, but we import. There's another field here which is not seen on this view, but it's available in the backend, called post-tax total. We add up all the line items post-tax total. We take a total of that for this invoice. We take a total of the license summary, of all the totals in the license summary, and we match it to this total here. And if there's a difference of more than 0.2, and whichever currency that is, in the currency of the invoice, we reject the invoice, because these should be exactly the same. So which meant that Microsoft is giving us an invoice, but it's not given us the full summary of the child records, or the full child records, which implies that this could come in 2 or 3 days later. So rather than bringing in the partial invoice and then complicating our invoicing process later on, because then as a partner, you'd have to watch out for that and then make sure that that invoice is, you have to partially go and back invoice the customers, and it just complicates the whole invoicing process. We'd rather not import the invoice if the integrity fails. This is the integrity check that we do. So with that, so that was the integrity check that I talked about. The other thing is the previous invoices are checked daily for changes. So every time, let's say today you had an invoice that comes in and the integrity check passes, and then you've imported that, system imports that in. But tomorrow an invoice comes in, the same invoice, we look at the same invoice the next day as well, and make sure that the numbers match, the totals on the invoice matches. So in case the total doesn't match, we flag this, and I'll show you how that comes up. So that's another thing. So you're now notified of invoices that have changed behind the scenes, so to say. We have a way to manually pull in the provider invoice. So let's have a look at this new feature. Now, if you go to provider invoices, there is a button here called sync provider invoice. If I click on that, I get an option to bring this particular invoice in. So let's say there was an invoice that didn't download and I had to do some fixes, and I've done the fixes, and now I want to import the invoice. I could wait until the next day, or I could now download this invoice on demand. So if I select a provider here, this one lists all the automatic providers. So if I select the automatic provider, it's going to fetch a list of the invoices, and it'll show me all the invoices along with the status. So this one invoice is not downloaded, and there are other invoices which are already active in my system. So if I try to download an active invoice, it won't allow me to. But if I download an inactive invoice, then obviously it will allow me to and download that invoice. One thing to note is, remember I talked about the integrity check. You can override that. Let's say you get a notification that says the invoice failed an integrity check, but you had to invoice the customer because the integrity check maybe was very small, and for whatever business reasons you decide that it's okay. I'd rather import the invoice now and not have to worry about not have to wait for 2 or 3 days. You can come here to the manual screen. You can override the tolerance value. You can specify, let's say, you know what, I want to do it $5 or whatever 5 is a number, 500, whatever that your choice is. You're overriding the tolerance value. You can hit submit, and the system will then allow for tolerance value up to that amount that you've specified. Yeah, so that's the other new capability in version 2.5 available to you now. And just going back to my slides, just give me 1 second. Right. So we talked about the screen to manually pull in. We have notifications now, and I'll talk about notifications a little bit. But so every day that the invoicing process runs, the provider invoice import process runs, you will receive a notification. You'll receive an email. This email is driven through an email template. And again, I will go back to the email templates and let's have a look at what that says. So if I go into administration and email templates, you will notice a provider notification notification of import of provider invoices. If I go ahead and click on that, there is a to field here. This is the emails to which this is the notification to who this email will go to. You can set up a from address, but you should definitely go ahead and change this to a to address here. You will otherwise, once that's done, you will start receiving emails for this. You can change the format if you want to, but obviously there are some tables that require here. There are two main sections. There's an invoice requiring attention section, and there's an invoice imported successfully. The invoice imported successfully will list all the invoices that were successfully imported. So there was no problem with that. But then before that, there's a section that says the invoices that require attention. And what that might be, there are 3 cases where invoices require attention. And if I go back to my slide here, one is an import failed. So there were some references on the invoice which couldn't be resolved. Now, for people that have had this, that are using this for a while, would have noticed, and I'll go back here. Let's go back to our provider invoices. Let me go ahead and import an invoice that was earlier on. And this is a successful invoice. Hold on, sorry. I'm going to go ahead and pick up an inactive invoice. These invoices have an error, so let's go ahead and see what's wrong. Earlier on, you could see some errors that were listed here. Now, what will happen is that, second, I'm trying to find something that is.
Yusuf, I don't know that they're going to be reference errors in the sky blue environment.
Right. So yeah. So I think this environment will not have. But what I wanted to say was, you will notice that there will be only 2 lines in that blob. Earlier on, we should have a whole list of IDs that would say that these references couldn't be resolved. Now you see two entries in there. You could see a warnings, and you'll see an errors over there, and there are CSV files attached to the note section. There's an error CSV or a warning CSV. The warning CSV says that these are references, or rather these are situations where it'll list situations where you need to fix something, but they're not fatal, which means that they will not cause the invoice import to fail. So you might see an invoice that's successfully imported. You still might see warnings in that, and that's okay, because that's not required for us to import the invoice. But it's good that you look at this and fix them anyway, because that might help you later on. But then there are, for failed invoices, you will see an errors.csv, and that will list all the items that have caused the invoice to fail. And it'll give you the what that was, whether it was a subscription, whether it was a customer reference, the ID of that reference, and a brief description of what you need to do with this. So even that error reporting has been improved, and you're able to now consume this information a lot more easily. So that's why the import failed, right? Because of the references couldn't be resolved. The second issue is that the invoice has changed. Now, this is the situation. You'll notice that the invoice was actually imported with a value, and then Microsoft or the provider reports a different value for the invoice at a future date. So let's say 2 days ago, the invoice was imported with 5,000. Now we see that the invoice is now 5,500. This report will highlight that. This email will highlight that for you as well. The status will be invoice changed. And finally, checksum failed, where, like I said, the totals don't match up. So in this case, we are not going to import the invoice, and you will receive a notification. So there's one notification sent out with all the summary, rather than sending you one per invoice import. There's one that goes for the daily import. So watch out for this email. Configure your email templates, and watch out for this this email. This could be pretty useful, because it'll help you identify gaps in your usage, especially those that are doing those that are dealing with Azure. Right. Now, if an invoice comes in, and let's say there might be situations where you might need to correct, let's say the situation where the invoice value changed, right? Where you had some invoice and now they're reporting a different number. So you might want to delete or deactivate invoices. Some things to consider in those scenarios is that provider invoices of child records that actually can be part of the sales invoicing process. They could be linked to our sales invoices. If you delete a provider invoice, this will lead to inconsistencies on the sales invoice. So we have to be careful while we perform this action. Generally speaking, you might have, and there's no specific guidance we can give you, because how you manage this really depends on the way you've got things set up. For example, let's say this change comes back the next day and you've not sent invoices to the client. In this case, you might delete the invoices, and delete the provider invoices and regenerate them. It could be that simple. But imagine if this change comes in a few days later, where you've already billed this to the client. Then do you go ahead and issue a credit note? Do you go ahead and delete the invoices? I mean, that is more of an accounting issue. And to further complicate things, you might have actually pushed this invoice out to your accounting or some other third-party systems. So we don't have a full picture of what you do once the invoice gets generated. So I hope that gives you an idea about the the complications that might happen if you were to delete the invoices. So it's on a case-by-case basis. You have to evaluate what needs to be done and take appropriate action. One thing that I will tell you is if you try to delete or reactivate a provider invoice that has invoiced child records, the system will prevent you from doing this because it knows that if you do this, there are going to be ramifications. So it prevents you from doing this. It's only when you mark those child records as uninvoiced will it then allow you to go ahead and deactivate or delete a provider invoice. Right. Any questions so far? I want to take a little bit of a moment here and see if there are any questions that before I move on.
There is one question related to the app screen and how you use it. I mean, the full question is, how do we choose the app screen like you have?
You mean this which app screen? I'm not clear.
I'm not clear on that. Can we unmute you, Donovan? Would that be okay? I'm not sure.
All right, we'll come back to that question towards the end.
Yep.
Donovan, if you are okay to unmute, just let us know, and then we'll just go ahead and do that.
Yeah. I'm good. You can hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now. Yes, go ahead, Donovan.
Yeah, it's just a simple CRM question. I thought the group might appreciate it. You're using the advanced screen with CRM there, where you've got a much nicer menu than the traditional CRM screen. So if you just want to,
right?
Yeah, I thought,
right.
So how do we see that app?
Okay, so this is called the Unified Client Interface.
Yes.
And the way to go about this is you can force it to do this by going to, and then, you go ahead and say, and then just put a force UCI equal to 1. If you do this at the end, then it'll load the force, it'll load the interface for that. But if you want to make it permanently available, you have to go into the dynamic CRM settings and change the default behavior for this. And we can explain that. We can probably send out a Yammer post on how to do that. Right. There was another question. Can you repeat the final status change to consider an invoice successful so we can fire the? So, like I said, the status of the invoice is very simple. It's either active or inactive. So if it's an active invoice, that means it's successful. So if you see, the reasons is all active. Earlier on, we had different status reasons. Now there are those different status reasons still exist for legacy reasons, but we only use the active ones. So if an invoice comes in now and it's active invoice, that means you're good to go. It's much simpler than before where you had multiple active statuses. Now there's only one active status. Yeah.